There was a time when dinner didn't come from apps or drive-thrus. It came from a trusted red and white cookbook sitting quietly on the kitchen counter. Inside those pages, families discovered meals that were simple, comforting, and unforgettable. But over the years, many of those recipes slowly disappeared, replaced by faster, modern trends. Today, we're opening that forgotten chapter once again. These are the dishes that once filled American homes with warmth, laughter, and the smell of something truly special. And chances are, you've never heard of most of them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and join us as we rediscover America's lost recipes. Long before convenience meals filled supermarket shelves, there was a dish that quietly became a weeknight hero in countless American homes: Betty Crocker's hamburger noodle bake. It wasn't flashy and it certainly wasn't complicated, but that was exactly its charm. In the 1950s, when families gathered around small kitchen tables after long days, this dish offered something more than just food. It offered comfort. The recipe was built on simple, affordable ingredients: ground beef, egg noodles, a creamy sauce, and just enough seasoning to bring everything together. Housewives of the era relied on meals like this to stretch budgets while still putting something warm and satisfying on the table. And somehow it always worked. The noodles soaked up the rich flavors, the beef added heartiness, and the oven transformed it all into a bubbling, golden-topped casserole. What made this dish truly special wasn't just its taste, but the feeling it carried. It was the sound of a fork tapping against a plate, the quiet hum of conversation, and the reassurance that no matter how busy life became, dinner would always bring everyone back together. Recipes like this weren't written to impress, they were written to last. But as time moved forward, meals like hamburger noodle bake began to fade. Faster options replaced them, and the old cookbooks were slowly pushed aside, collecting dust on forgotten shelves. Yet, for those who remember, the taste never truly disappeared. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Some recipes don't need to stay popular, they just need to be remembered. There was once a dessert that felt almost magical the moment it came out of the oven: Betty Crocker's impossible coconut pie. At first glance, it seemed too simple to be special. No crust to roll, no complicated steps to follow. Just a handful of pantry ingredients mixed together and poured into a single dish. But something extraordinary happened as it baked. During the 1960s, when convenience cooking was reshaping American kitchens, this recipe became a quiet sensation. As the pie cooked, it separated into layers all on its own. A soft, custard-like center formed in the middle, while a delicate crust appeared at the bottom, and a lightly golden top settled above it. It was as if the pie built itself without any effort, leaving many to wonder how something so easy could feel so complete. For families, it quickly became a favorite not just because it tasted good, but because it removed the stress from baking. There was no fear of getting the crust wrong or overcomplicating the process. It welcomed beginners and rewarded them with something that looked and felt impressive, even if it took very little time to prepare. The coconut added a gentle sweetness and texture that made each bite feel comforting and familiar. It was the kind of dessert that didn't demand attention, yet somehow became the one everyone remembered after the table was cleared. Over time, recipes like this were set aside as baking became more elaborate and trends shifted toward more decorative desserts. But impossible coconut pie carried something those newer recipes often lacked: a quiet simplicity that made it feel timeless. And perhaps that's why it still lingers in memory today, waiting to be made again. There was a time when a single skillet on the stove could feed an entire family, and one of the most trusted dishes to do just that was Betty Crocker's Sloppy Joe skillet supper. It wasn't elegant, and it didn't try to be. But in homes across America during the 1950s and 60s, it became something people counted on. This version of the classic Sloppy Joe went beyond the sandwich. Instead of piling the saucy meat onto buns, everything came together in one pan: ground beef, tomato sauce, onions, and often a handful of pantry staples that stretched the meal just a little further. Some added noodles, others folded in vegetables, making it adaptable to whatever was available at the time. It was practical cooking at its best. What made this dish stand out was its bold, slightly sweet flavor, balanced with just enough tang to keep it from feeling heavy. The aroma alone could fill a small home, drifting from the kitchen into every corner, quietly announcing that dinner was ready. And when it was finally served, it brought a kind of messy joy that didn't need perfection to be satisfying. Families didn't worry about presentation. Plates were filled generously, conversations overlapped, and laughter came easily. Meals like this weren't about impressing guests. They were about feeding people you loved. As decades passed, dishes like the Sloppy Joe skillet supper began to fade into the background, replaced by cleaner, quicker alternatives. But something was lost in that shift, the warmth of a meal that embraced its imperfections. Because sometimes the most memorable recipes aren't the neatest ones, they're the ones that leave a little mess behind. There was a time when stretching a single pound of ground beef into a full, satisfying meal was considered a small victory. One recipe that mastered this quiet art was Betty Crocker's Porcupine meatballs. The name alone sparked curiosity, but for families in the 1940s and 50s, it was a familiar and trusted favorite. These meatballs weren't ordinary. Mixed right into the ground beef was uncooked rice, a simple addition that transformed the dish completely. As the meatballs simmered slowly in a rich tomato sauce, the rice softened and expanded, poking out of the surface just enough to give them their signature porcupine look. It was clever, resourceful cooking, designed to make a little go a long way. But beyond its practicality, this dish carried a deep sense of comfort. The sauce thickened over time, wrapping each meatball in a warm, savory coating that felt both hearty and homemade. The texture was unlike anything else, tender beef combined with soft grains of rice, creating a bite that was both filling and gentle. In kitchens where budgets were tight and creativity mattered, recipes like this became essential. They weren't about luxury, they were about care, about making sure everyone at the table had enough. As years passed, porcupine meatballs slowly disappeared from everyday cooking, replaced by quicker, more modern dishes that required less patience. Yet something about them still lingers in memory: the slow simmer, the comforting aroma, the quiet satisfaction of turning simple ingredients into something meaningful. Because sometimes, the most unusual recipes are the ones that stay with us the longest. There was a time when dinner didn't need to be complicated to feel complete, and one dish that captured this perfectly was Betty Crocker's tuna wiggle. The name alone sounded playful, almost strange, but in kitchens across America during the 1950s, it was a reliable staple that families turned to again and again. At its heart, tuna wiggle was built from necessity. Canned tuna, egg noodles, and a simple creamy sauce came together to create something warm, filling, and incredibly easy to prepare. It was the kind of meal that could be made quickly after a long day, using ingredients that were always within reach. And somehow, despite its simplicity, it never felt like a compromise. As the noodles softened and absorbed the sauce, the dish took on a smooth, comforting texture. The tuna added a gentle richness, while small additions like peas or seasonings brought just enough variation to keep it interesting. It wasn't meant to impress guests or appear in magazines. It was meant to quietly do its job, feeding families with consistency and care. What made tuna wiggle memorable wasn't just the taste, but the role it played in everyday life. It was the meal that appeared without warning, the one that didn't require planning, yet always delivered a sense of familiarity. In homes where time and money were often limited, it became something dependable. Over time, however, dishes like tuna wiggle began to fade as tastes changed and convenience foods evolved. Its unusual name and modest appearance caused it to be overlooked, tucked away in old cookbooks and forgotten pages. But for those who remember it, tuna wiggle was never just a meal. It was a quiet reminder that simple things could still bring comfort. There was a time when a single pan in the oven could transform a few simple ingredients into something that felt almost celebratory. One such dish was Betty Crocker's chicken divan, a recipe that quietly brought elegance into everyday homes during the 1950s and 60s. At its core, Chicken divan was a combination of tender chicken, broccoli, and a creamy, rich sauce, often topped with a layer of melted cheese or buttery crumbs. It wasn't overly complicated, yet it carried a sense of refinement that made it stand out from typical weeknight meals. For many families, it was the dish you made when you wanted dinner to feel just a little more special. The origins of the recipe traced back to restaurant dining, but Betty Crocker helped bring it into home kitchens, simplifying the process without losing its charm. As it baked, the sauce thickened and settled into every layer, coating the chicken and vegetables in a warm, savory richness. The top turned golden, creating a gentle contrast to the softness beneath. What made chicken divan memorable wasn't just its flavor, but the way it blurred the line between comfort food and something more formal. It allowed home cooks to create a meal that felt elevated, even on an ordinary evening. Families gathered around the table with a quiet sense of anticipation, knowing this wasn't just another routine dinner. It was familiar, yet different enough to leave an impression. As time passed, recipes like chicken divan slowly faded from everyday cooking, replaced by quicker meals that required less preparation. But something about its balance, the simplicity paired with elegance, still lingers. Because sometimes, the meals we remember most are the ones that made ordinary nights feel just a little extraordinary. There was a time when a dessert didn't need layers of decoration or elaborate techniques to feel special. Sometimes, all it took was a chilled dish pulled from the refrigerator, gently set on the table after dinner. One such creation was Betty Crocker's frosted ribbon loaf, a dessert that quietly captured attention in the 1950s with its delicate appearance and surprising simplicity. At first glance, it looked almost too perfect to be homemade. Soft pastel layers stacked neatly together, each one slightly different in flavor or color, all held in place by a light, creamy filling. When sliced, it revealed gentle ribbons running through the loaf, creating a pattern that felt both elegant and comforting at the same time. What made this dessert unique wasn't just how it looked, but how it came together. Using gelatin, whipped toppings, and simple ingredients, home cooks could build something that felt almost artistic without needing professional skill. It was a reflection of an era when presentation began to matter just as much as taste, yet the process remained accessible to everyone. The texture was cool and smooth, melting softly with each bite. It wasn't heavy or overly sweet, making it the perfect ending to a hearty meal. And because it was served chilled, it carried a refreshing quality that stood out from traditional baked desserts. For many families, the frosted ribbon loaf became a quiet centerpiece at gatherings, admired before it was even tasted. But like many recipes of its time, it slowly disappeared as trends shifted toward newer, more modern desserts. Still, its memory lingers in those soft layers, proof that even the simplest creations can leave a lasting impression. There was a time when a casserole could tell a story all on its own, quietly capturing the spirit of an era. One such dish was Betty Crocker's beef and potato supreme, a recipe that graced tables across America in the 1950s and 60s. It wasn't fancy, but it carried a sense of reliability that families depended on. Built from humble ingredients, ground beef, tender potatoes, a creamy sauce, and sometimes a sprinkle of cheese, this casserole was all about turning simplicity into satisfaction. The meat browned and melded with the sauce, while the potatoes absorbed every bit of flavor, creating layers that felt both hearty and comforting. It was a dish that could feed a crowd without demanding time or special skills, which made it perfect for busy households. But what made beef and potato supreme truly memorable wasn't just the taste, it was the ritual of preparing it. Mothers and fathers stirred the pot carefully, children watched eagerly, and the oven became a quiet witness to the smells that promised warmth and fullness. In an era before fast food and ready-made dinners, recipes like this offered reassurance. A home-cooked meal could be simple, satisfying, and still feel like a treat. Over time, however, it gradually vanished from cookbooks and kitchens, replaced by flashier or faster alternatives. Yet those who remember it often speak with a kind of nostalgia for the cozy evenings it once represented, the sound of forks scraping plates, the gentle hum of family chatter, and the comforting aroma that lingered long after the meal was finished. Beef and potato supreme reminds us that sometimes the most unassuming recipes carry the deepest memories, quietly preserving the warmth of a time when cooking wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about feeding the heart. There was a time when a breakfast could be both hearty and comforting, yet quick enough to fit into the busy mornings of post-war America. One such recipe was Betty Crocker's sausage and egg breakfast ring, a dish that transformed ordinary ingredients into something festive and memorable. At first glance, it looked more like a centerpiece than a simple breakfast. Sausage, eggs, and cheese were arranged in a circular pattern, baked to golden perfection, and often topped with a light glaze or sprinkle of herbs. It was visually striking, yet surprisingly easy to make, perfect for families who wanted a special meal without hours in the kitchen. What made this recipe stand out wasn't just the taste, it was the ritual around it. Children would gather, peeking over counters as the ring baked, drawn in by the sizzling sausage aroma and the promise of a warm, satisfying meal. Every bite combined the richness of eggs, the savory punch of sausage, and the creamy comfort of melted cheese, creating layers of flavor that felt indulgent yet familiar. In many homes, this breakfast became more than a morning meal. It became a tradition. On weekends or holidays, the ring would appear at the table, signaling togetherness and care. It was simple enough to prepare regularly, yet special enough to make ordinary mornings feel celebratory. Over time, as breakfast trends shifted towards cereals, quick sandwiches, and ready-made options, recipes like the sausage and egg breakfast ring began to disappear from everyday cooking. But for those who remember it, the dish remains a symbol of warmth, effort, and the quiet joy of sharing a homemade meal with family. Sometimes, the meals we forget aren't gone forever. They're waiting in the memory of a scent, a taste, or a tradition ready to be rediscovered. In the 1950s, convenience and creativity often collided in the most unexpected ways, and one recipe that perfectly captured this was Betty Crocker's macaroni loaf. At first glance, it seemed like a simple casserole, but for families across America, it was a clever solution to stretch ingredients while keeping meals comforting and satisfying. Macaroni loaf combined cooked macaroni, ground beef, eggs, and a modest amount of seasoning, all baked together until firm yet tender. Some families added bits of vegetables, cheese, or breadcrumbs to make it more substantial, while others kept it plain, relying on ketchup or sauce for flavor. It was economical, filling, and required minimal effort, qualities that made it a staple in kitchens where time and money were always in short supply. The dish wasn't just about practicality, it carried an emotional weight. As it baked, the aroma filled the home, signaling a warm, hearty meal was on its way. Plates were served generously, and the simple comfort of macaroni and beef brought families together at the table. It was a recipe that didn't rely on extravagance, yet it left an impression, creating memories that lingered long after the last slice was eaten. Over time, macaroni loaf slowly faded from common use, replaced by faster meals and boxed alternatives that required even less effort. Yet, for those who grew up with it, the memory of its soft, flavorful layers and the golden crust on top remains vivid. Rediscovering dishes like macaroni loaf reminds us that the heart of a meal often lies not in complexity or presentation, but in the quiet way it nourishes both body and spirit. These forgotten recipes, once central to American family life, carry the warmth, resourcefulness, and care of a time when cooking was about more than just sustenance. It was about connection. These 10 recipes are more than just forgotten pages in a cookbook. They are echoes of a time when meals were made with care, patience, and a touch of love. Each dish tells a story of families gathered around the table, of kitchens filled with comforting aromas, and of simple ingredients transformed into lasting memories. As we bring these lost recipes back into the light, we reconnect with a tradition of cooking that celebrated togetherness over convenience. If you've enjoyed this journey through America's culinary past, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue rediscovering the flavors that shaped generations.